Hello, and we're here today to talk about B Corp Month, and the theme being this way forwards. This is something that is very, very close to my heart, really, really important, I think, for business, but also for investment. And we're going to talk to you a little bit more about why that is. So I'm just going to hand over to Kate to talk us through why we're doing this video.
Great. Yeah, I'm also personally invested in the B Corp movement, and thought that this was a good opportunity for Charlotte and I to have a good conversation about different aspects of the B Corp movement, why we think it's important, and also to be able to share that with others who might find this information useful. The B Corp movement might be new to them, and hopefully provide a bit of insight from our experience. So the reason why I think it's important is I'm totally invested because I used to work at B Lab UK, which is the charity behind the B Corp movement. And I joined that in 2015 when it launched. So I was there for about 6.5 years, and I led the community and then also all of our programmatic work. So I'm biased, totally biased. I think it's a great idea. But I actually left there at the end of 2021, and I now work for Newcore Capital, which is a member of Pensions for Purpose, and I'm the Director of Sustainability. So Newcore Capital is a real estate investment manager focusing on social infrastructure, and it's also obviously a B Corp, and we've just recertified. Charlotte, should I hand over to you?
Yeah. So I'm Charlotte. I'm the CEO at Pensions for Purpose. We are a B Corp. Well, we actually started out as a non-profit when Karen Shackleton set up the business in 2017. So we've gone through that process of becoming a profit for purpose business, and it's written into our Articles of Association. I think it's so important because it really gets you to think about all of your stakeholders. It gets you to think about your impact on people and planet alongside profit, and it means it's talked about in the boardroom. You know, what gets talked about in the boardroom gets done, and I think that's really, really important. There's another aspect to that, which is Pension for Purpose. It, represents an ecosystem. We're working with pension funds to get them to embed impact investing. So genuinely, impact is in everything that we do, and we look at that whole ecosystem. And you realize that better business and impact investing are two sides of the same coin. They need to come together, and they absolutely mutually overlap. So it makes sense to me that if you had asset managers and investment consultants and legal firms that were B corporations and had that written into the way that they operate as businesses, you would get that alignment with the asset owners that they're there to serve. So yes, I'm absolutely personally and professionally invested in this, and I think it makes really, really good business sense. But there's something else to it as well, which is, this isn't new. A lot of these principles, have come about in the past, and sometimes we lose our way a little bit, or directionally things become challenging. And I think it's useful to point to things that have happened in the past that can lay the foundations for how we operate as businesses in the future.
Totally. Yeah. And I think, we can be blindsided by the news and everything that's happening, especially being led in America, and the backlash against ESG. But actually, if we look back to kind of, companies that were evolving in kind of the post-industrial revolution, and you look at, names like Cadbury's and the creation of Bourneville, or you look at Guinness, and actually all of these companies really cared about their employees because they recognized looking after them, ensuring they have good health, good places, clean places to live, will feed back better for them as a business, not only because they'll have less time off work, but also because they're more likely to stay there. And I think we've kind of lost a bit of that over the last kind of, couple of 100 years to some extent. And I think a lot of that was typified by Milton Friedman, who wrote a seminal essay that many of you might know in the 1970s, saying the business of business is business, right? So the only purpose of a business is to return profits to its shareholders. And that has kind of overtaken a lot of mainstream business in the way that it's thinking. And I think it's a shame, but it also demonstrates, and as you were mentioning, Charlotte, there are lots of businesses who are shifting away from that narrative, who are recognizing the importance of interdependence, the recognition that business can't really work in a silo because of its value chain, because of its employees, because of the planet, especially on the supply chain. And so we're starting to shift, I hope, in that direction. And B Corp has been a really great example to show that the interest in that shift. There are other things like the Good Business Charter, other ways for businesses to kind of provide a signal that actually they think about more things than just shareholder returns. Although shareholder returns are important, and I think that's also important, we are talking about businesses. But actually, if you've recognised the importance of stakeholders, you feed into those returns as well, which is fundamental.
And I think you brought up something really important there, Kate, which is this point about silos. You know, we operate in an ecosystem, and often we talk about biodiversity and natural capital, we talk about climate change, all these things, and that is the recognition that we can't separate ourselves out from what is happening in the world and what is happening to society. There is no way of insulating ourselves from those risks, which are also opportunities.
Yeah.
But I think what's happened around business and investment is that we've created these silos, whether it's asset class silos or whether it's public versus private versus third sector, with very separate tax systems and ways and thinking around investment that hasn't helped. And what's quite nice to see is this sort of coming back round to some of those core principles about, you know, what purpose is, you know, what systemic need is, you know, and how we're addressing effectively Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of need, you know, that baseline of the pyramid, which is, you know, having safety, having a home, having access to water and food, and all of those things that are really important for us to sustain life. So it's great to see that things are shifting, but obviously we need more to be happening.
Yeah, for sure.
So would you say that, you know, the B Corp certification is about systems change or being a good business? You know, can it be both of those things?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I think a lot of people think it's just a community of businesses or a group of businesses that are doing really great things, and that's lovely. But actually, to your point about interdependence and thinking about kind of how we shift systems, at the heart of the B Corp movement is trying to change the economic system. And so the B Corp movement recognises that capitalism is good. It just doesn't have the right operating model. It just hasn't quite shifted in the right direction. And that domination of shareholder primacy means that actually one of the biggest contributors to the problems that we have today is business. And actually, it's the most powerful man-made force on the planet. So how can we harness that and create change? And so what they're trying to do is, yes, certified businesses, which is really important, a collection of businesses who are leading the way, who are doing good things, and they're validated for doing that. They're not just saying that they're doing that. But they're also providing a free tool for businesses to use. So the B Impact Assessment, anyone can use it. It's globally, it's free. I don't know the numbers now, but it will have definitely had over 100,000 users across the world. And then you've also got the most important thing for many people, and we were talking about kind of governance earlier, is thinking about regulation and legislative change. And so that is changing and that is happening. So all over the world, different laws have been put in place in France and Italy, across Latin America, recognizing that businesses need the freedom to be able to operate for their stakeholders, not just their shareholders. Especially in the US, often it's seen that you need to make sure you're within the line of the law, and the line of the law is saying that you need to operate for the benefit of your shareholders. So actually lots of states have enacted special legislation called the Benefit Corporation legislation to be able to change that. And in the UK, I know we'll touch on this later, there's the Better Business Act. And that's also trying to kind of shift the narrative a little bit, which is key. There are some people, and it's important to recognise this, that say that the B Corp movement isn't necessarily going far enough. And I think there is validity in that, and there's questions. I don't think one organisation is going to be able to change a system. In fact, we need other system changes and organisations like Pensions for Purpose that can come in and mobilise and engage and also bring people forward and have conversations like we're having to enable people to think a little bit broader and about the world that we want, right? And how do we create that? And how do we ensure that we're all thriving in the future?
And you kind of referenced something really interesting there, because, you know, B Corp was really, really important for us, for Pensions for Purpose, but it doesn't in and of itself prescribe a particular organizational model. And what we found, which was really interesting, is that we're a kind of quasi business in that we have membership. So we have that kind of member base from which we get an understanding of where there are gaps and challenges and where solutions need to be provided. And we use that as a map to be able to understand how we should be producing services. Now, that's very much come from us.
Yeah.
So us saying, well, actually, if we've demonstrated there's a need, then we can justify the service. Then, in fact, the profit comes as a result because you are addressing a gap that exists in the marketplace. It also means that you don't have to heavily market or heavily sell because the need is easily recognizable.
Yeah.
So most businesses have worked on the basis that you have to create a need for somebody. So there's a huge amount that goes into the marketing, the research in order to do that. Whereas actually, if you were addressing systemic need, the need for marketing and other things to go into it is far less. So for instance, we spend far less on marketing. We don't have somebody who does sales that's embedded within the work that we do. And so it completely changes the makeup of the business, which is really, really fascinating. And it also becomes mutually reinforcing because if you're addressing the need, people want to be members. And that's really, really spot, but that's a very, very different mentality. That's actually embedding it in your operations, your services, in everything.
Your purpose, right? And it's interesting actually, if I think about Newcore, we invest in social infrastructure, and in a similar way, there is a massive lack of investment that's happened over the years, and there is a real need and growing need for assets that enable society to operate. And actually, in the same way that a social infrastructure says we have special educational needs schools, the only way that school is going to be successful is if there is a need for that school. And it goes back to that way of thinking. And I think there are so many businesses who have just thought that there's a gap in the market to be able to create that thing. And that isn't to say that, I'm sure there are many B Corps who do that, right? And that is great, as long as you make sure that what you're contributing actually is more than what you're taking, right? And I think that's the interesting tension around B Corps, but also actually another interesting thing. And if we talk about B Corp Month, and you mentioned the theme was this way forwards, and this idea that being a B Corp is kind of a journey, not a destination. And I think that's so important because we talk about how we can always improve, and the same with every business, every B Corp, certified B Corp, the whole purpose is to improve. And maybe if I ask you a question just about why it's important for Pensions for Purpose to be that better business. You started to touch on it, but you could just add a little bit more.
Well, I think you also recognize that once you've built a platform and you've got members and you've got a captive audience of people starting to listen to you, you are far more than just the service you're providing. You are emulating the sort of business, the culture, the values that you want to see. And so you can't be asking businesses to be a certain way if you are not operating in that way yourselves. And the other thing that was really interesting is we did research looking at investment consultants and fiduciary managers, and we found that the ones that had a better thread from their business purpose all the way through to the advice that they were providing to clients integrated ESG and impact more comprehensively. And so it's about the questions you ask in order to understand how embedded these things are, because we all say it, and again, it's not about carrot or stick. It's just a case of being aware that this is a very different way of thinking about business. And only by being very open, very humble and honest about how we're operating and where we could get to, are we going to make that transition. We can't be in a sort of a state where we want to suppress or hide things because it makes us vulnerable. I think we're at a stage now where we have to be very open about the challenges and what it takes. And I say this, it's been much easier for us as a business emerging to set our structure out as we have. If you're an existing business, trying to retrofit this is hard. It is hard work. But I think the key thing is it can be done. So yes, we decided that we wanted to be that business that we were telling other businesses that they could be. And also, giving a voice. We're 100% female managed, but we do have a diverse team. And that, that's really, really important. Flexible working is something that's, embedded in how we work. We also are a remote business. We don't have physical offices. So if we need to use a physical office, we use one of our members' offices in their free space. So it really does run through, all of the decisions that we make. And there are people who work for our business that wouldn't be able to do what they were doing if we didn't offer flexible working.
Yeah.
It's that inclusive aspect as well that's really important. So we're constantly looking and using what we do as a service to inform how we operate as a business and how we can be better.
Yeah.
And we want to use those insights to help support other business.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think when you're thinking about kind of, what are the problems or the reality, actually the flip side to the problem is there's an opportunity, right? And a way to kind of expand. And I think that's important to remember when we're thinking about a lot of this stuff, which it can seem quite challenging, but actually if you keep thinking through it, you'll find a way to make something of it. And I think it's interesting from a Newcore perspective, we think about, and it took us a while to articulate this, but you could be a really good business from a management platform, but behave really badly in the way that you manage your funds, or the companies that you invest in, or for us, the assets that we invest in. And actually what you need to think is actually, how does this run through, or what's the kind of the golden thread, and enables you to consistently operate in a consistent level. B Corp actually helps with that to some extent, because it asks you lots of operational questions. But actually, we've started to articulate that a little bit better, that we see that the management platform has to operate brilliantly, and it does, and we've just recertified at 164 points, which is very exciting. But we also have external validation from a fund level, so we submit to GRESB, so looking at what we're doing, and then also how are we looking at our assets, how are we improving them, how are we aligning to our net zero goals of 2040. And I think it's really important that, again, we recognise that this is not an achievement. Yes, we've scored really highly on B Corp, but that by no means we're finished. We haven't got somewhere, we haven't got to that destination. We'll always need to improve, and there's always so much more that we can do. And I think actually that humility and thinking, how can we do better? It is another really important trait with a lot of this stuff.
And finance is just so important in this. And as we've sort of touched on, finance is itself often not inclusive.
Yeah.
So why is it important then to get, investors, asset owners, managers involved in the B Corp movement?
Yeah. And this is one of the reasons why we're having this conversation, is because we recognise that there's such a huge opportunity to engage businesses and investors, because the reality is, if you're trying to change an economic system, you're not going to be able to change it without the key players, right? The people who have the most significant change, the drivers. Yes, you've got regulation, which is obviously important, and you've got moves by the FCA, and it's brilliant for the SDR. But actually, what you need is investors to start dictating what they want, and what kind of returns that they want to see. And I think the reality is that we need to move away from modern portfolio theory and think broader than risk and return, right? ESG was kind of just put into that risk element, and actually we need to think about impact or broader stakeholder engagement. What does that happen? And recognize the interconnectedness of that investment. But also, if we think about supply chains or people, all of that weaves into, there's an element of risk, but actually if you take that risk to being positive, what's the positive impact that could have that can turbocharge exactly what we're doing? And so engaging investors, asset owners in thinking about this more broadly is so important. And you have to lead by example, right? So yes, that we want them to invest responsibly and sustainably, and with an understanding of what they're doing, the social environmental performance of their investments, but also they need to be aligned, right? They need to be thinking about this golden thread in the same way that Newcore does, which is, okay, how do we operate as a platform? How do our funds operate? And then how are our companies or our assets actually operating? And that's, it's fundamental for us to thrive on a planet like this that is at the moment in a very challenging situation. And the only way, from my perspective, it's actually the reason why I moved and I left B Lab, is to work in the finance system, because I thought I can't stand from the outside talking about this if I don't understand what the trade-offs are. If I don't understand how you create change, I need to work for a business that is doing something, and understand how that operates as a business. So that's my own kind of personal journey on this, and that's why I'm determined to engage as many businesses, as many investors, as many asset owners into understanding this and the opportunity that comes with making it thrive, which I think is important. I wanted to ask you a question. We talked briefly earlier about the Better Business Act, and you recently gave evidence to the Work and Pensions Select Committee on fiduciary duty, getting them to try and engage on climate change. And one of the things you mentioned was the Better Business Act. And before I ask you your question about why it's important, maybe the Better Business Act is trying to amend Section 172, and it's giving directors kind of the freedom or the ability to consider stakeholder interests, so broader than that fiduciary duty, and it's switching the default. So right now, the default that people understand from the Companies Act, and when they download those default articles of association, is that the purpose of their business is to return profits to their shareholders. And what which can be, when you certify as a B Corp, you actually, and you mentioned this earlier, you kind of change your deed, your articles of association, to say you'll have consideration of broader things. And the Companies Act is actually great because it allows that insertion, that additional paragraph. But actually what this wants to do is switch the default, so you don't have to add in a paragraph. So, sorry, always thought it was important, but a bit of background, but why do you think it's important?
I think it's important because I'm the chief executive, of the business. I like to think of myself more like a sort of chief ecosystems officer, because the reality is that I don't have a business. If I don't have a team, if I don't have people to sell to, if I don't have a society and I don't have an environment, I don't have a business. So it's all entirely interlinked. But for me, it was so obvious because of my experience being in board meetings and the sorts of questions that you ask and how you put across the financials. And what gets scrutinized. And no matter how long-term your mindset, or the individuals that you have in the room, there is always a tendency to focus on short-term financials. You're doing quarterly board meetings. You're probably not looking too much further forward than maybe annual, maybe 3-year projections. And people are a cost in a profit and loss, statement. It's very difficult without the narrative, the qualitative narrative that goes alongside, to make sure that people and planet are considered alongside the financials, which do take a significant amount of time to be covered in a board meeting. So you need somebody who is going to help support that, and anchor it. And often the people who are focused on sustainability sit outside of the boardroom.
Yeah.
And that's the reality. And I think, we do need to get to a stage where those actors are in the room. Now, whether they're in the room, by proxy, or whether they're in the room via the executive team, which would obviously always be my preference, it needs to be talked about there, because that's what gets pushed out towards the rest of the business. It's also what sets up the culture, the values, how you set your strategy. So it's incredibly important. So that was why I felt that change was needed. The other reason why it's important in an investment context is that changing fiduciary duty for trustees of pension schemes, is one mechanism, but those trustees are themselves now companies. So professional trustees, not lay trustees, are companies. The advisors that they have, the legal firms, the investment consultants, the asset managers, they're all companies. The underlying businesses are companies. So there's something that ties everything together here, and it's companies. And then the other thing is that the sponsors of pension funds are companies. So you can see that, and this is exactly what I said to the Work and Pension Select Committee, you cannot expect one actor in the system with significantly less time, pretty much the same amount of resource, to be able to pivot the entire investment chain on which they rely, often with very little skills and knowledge, because of the amount that's required to do this. And the reason why that is because we're still relying on outdated economic models. You know, you referenced it. We're still relying on modern portfolio theory. We're still creating strategic asset allocation frameworks that puts infrastructure in a bucket and then real estate in a bucket. And, you know, and that's why we're not getting these strategies to line up, because we're still trying to separate all of them out. You know, in a housing context, it's why, you know, in the past, not so much now, but it still is the case, you know, estates get built on the outskirts of a town without any thought as to the transport, the heating network, you know, the energy grid, you know, or work or employment for that community. And that's what we need to change. We need to understand that these are systems. So yeah, that's why it made sense to me. It has to be talked about in the boardroom. You know, one of the key reasons why it's got done is because Karen and I believe in it so strongly. You know, and it does come from that. So you need, but the other thing is you need best practice. Regulation only gets so far. You know, it's great that, you know, we have the potential to make this change with the Better Business Act, and I think it gets us, you know, a long way there. But the reality is there will still always be people who are leading and people who are lagging, you know, in any area. So what we need is the ability to raise the profile of those who are doing it best and who are leading the way. So it's about showcasing that as well.
It's so important. When kind of around COP26, we created a campaign called Boardroom 2030. And actually that was thinking about kind of future generations and young people and thinking about the future and how does that get represented in the decisions that need to be made today, which is like so important, but actually very difficult. And to your point of like who represents that thought, who represents that ability. And I think that's, you know, there are lots of really interesting companies who are trying to think about that from a nature perspective. You've got Faith in Nature, whoever nature's represented. Yeah, there's lots of different interesting businesses who are doing that. And with that and that best practice, do you think, or what do you think businesses can teach kind of the politicians of today? How do you think that they can kind of influence, or what initiatives do you think that the politicians should be looking at?
I think what's really interesting is, you know, we touched on, you know, the kind of evolution of business and evolution of politics, and the reality is so many systems we have become very adversarial, and that need to compete has stopped the ability for progression on things like sharing data freely. You know, I see that a lot, you know, in the industry. And if we're looking to make progress and leapfrog, there has to be a point at which we're willing to pass certain data on freely. And that comes back to this issue about thinking that our proprietary systems are our value, you know, or the products that we're supplying. The reality is it's the people. It's the interpretation of ideas. It's the way that we market and sell business. That's everything is about the people. So this is about like valuing your people, not necessarily all the other things that we tend to value. And I think it's exactly the same in politics. It's far too, or at least it comes across. I think actually in the background there is a lot more cross-party support on a number of these issues, but in reality it comes across as incredibly adversarial, and that isn't helpful for creating collaboration. And yet across the investment industry, you see Climate Action 100 plus, you see, you know, Institutional Investor Group for Climate Change. You see the different task forces emerging around natural capital. And this year there'll be a task force for inequality and social related financial disclosures, which I'm, you know, really, really pleased to see. And this all comes from, you know, cross-industry, cross-business commitment, which I think is brilliant. There are, you know, people across our industry who recognize we've got to break down some of these barriers by being open and transparent with the information and data that we have. And Pensions for Purpose has taken that view as well. You know, there's a lot of things that we produce that are freely available on our website, you know, and people would say to us, oh, it's intellectual capital, but if it's not out there, it can't be acted on. So there has to be a point at which you say that needs to be, you know, in the market.
This isn't, and this is beyond party politics, right? What we're talking about. And I think there's so important to recognize that often that short-term gain, whichever some people might see in the way that, especially politicians, the way they operate, actually this is bigger than that. And you have more respect for that politician who can stand up and say, hang on a second, we need to think about this. And that's one of the reasons why the BIA that B Corp has is free. Right, it's free for anyone to use, because the reality is they're just trying to change the game. They just want business to perform better and to consider so many different elements that often aren't considered. So I think that's key. On the theme of thinking about how we can improve, not just politicians, but reflecting on the BIA, what do you think are areas for improvement? It's definitely imperfect. It's taken a long time to change. It's meant to iterate every couple of years, and what they're deciding to do is a bigger iteration that's sort of been delayed a little bit, but hopefully coming in at the end of 2024, 25, reframing what it means to be a B Corp around kind of 10 key areas. But are there areas that you think that are missing, which I think you might think there are?
Yeah, it's really interesting. We're in a really interesting time where we know there's less public finance, hence why the UK government is working so hard to try and get, private investors to put their capital to work. And so we've got this sort of strange situation where, this sort of tripartite system of public, private, and third sector starts to kind of blur a bit. And B Corp in and of itself doesn't provide a social license to operate. That's not what it's there to do. It's assessing the environmental and social performance of businesses, which is brilliant. But it's only one area. And so you could be having a positive impact, but you could be addressing what I would describe as a second or third order effect. So not a root cause or root issue. And so I think it would be really useful for B Corp to be able to recognise, some of the nuances between addressing systemic need, like root causes of problems around things like inequality, land degradation, biodiversity loss, those sorts of things, and those, who are addressing, effects as a result of those root problems. That's not to say that one is better than the other, but it's more to empower investors and consumers in terms of what we should be focusing on and what we should be tackling. And, this is all about the fact that, doing business better should be about addressing systemic need. And to give you an idea of this, we use the kind of the 3-word thing around recycling. So we say, to start off, you reduce, you reuse, you recycle.
Yeah.
The difficulty is that the first one is the most important.
Yeah.
And I think that's often what we forget is the reducing consumption is the most important thing we should do. Whereas what we're tending to do is to set kind of levels of growth on the basis of replacing current levels of consumption, which in and of itself is flawed.
Yeah.
So that's what I would like to see. I'd like to see a better framework around addressing systemic need.
Yeah.
And then I think, the other thing, you'd expect me to say this because I'm heading up Pensions for Purpose, is actually really looking at pensions. I think one of the biggest systemic issues we have actually revolves pensions and the fact and lifetime savings more broadly for individuals, because they're just not saving enough, and a lot of that comes down to the inequality that we see, whether that's gender inequality or other forms of inequality in the system that are being compounded by the way that our pension system works and the way that business works. So my view is, we've taken this view that we want to step up employer contributions year on year into double digit, and we are a relatively small business, so it is more difficult for us to do that. But we believe we're not a sustainable business if we are not supporting our employees to be able to live a decent life in retirement. So it has to cover all aspects. Now, that's an element I would love to see in the impact assessment, not least because if we contribute more to pensions, the assets that can go into things that can disrupt, that can be more sustainable, would increase. And Make My Money Matter came out with a brilliant sort of campaign saying that your investments through your pension are 21 times more impactful than some of the things that you can do individually or in your own home. So really, really important. So those are the 2 areas I think that would be useful to look at. I would get into tax and that side of things, but I think if we just focused on those 2 elements to start off with, I think that would go a long way.
Yeah. And we're big discussions about the tax at Newcore. We think it's really important being onshore, but also just recognizing that you need to pay your way. And actually, how do you invest in social infrastructure if you're, choosing to have different structures? And yeah, it's fundamental. So yeah, agree on that totally. I think the other challenge that has been with B Lab, although it's never been talked about that much, is that you can be not that great at some areas. So the assessments over 5 different areas where it's governance, workers, environment, community, customers, and you could be quite low in some of those areas and still certify. And I think actually bringing that floor to exactly the same level or a very similar level, so actually you can't just ignore one area of your business and be really great in the other. Putting that floor in is going to be really important. I think that is happening for the future, but for sure. And pensions as well. I'm a big believer in it. I love Make My Money Matter. I think they're absolutely brilliant. In fact, wrote to our pension scheme to let them know how disappointed I was, how far down when I thought that they were really good pensions company, and then it turned out they weren't that great. So
yeah. And it's just thinking, as a last thing, it's how we can support each other. B Corps are an ecosystem, and as a small business, the trade-offs are massive. You've got a small team, but you're having to work with large businesses that have different terms. And what would be great is also to try and be more accommodating, from big businesses to small businesses, in recognition that, small businesses, in reality, 95% of them don't make it.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the long term. And by the way, most, a large proportion of those small businesses will be run by women. So if we're trying to tackle things like inequality, we have to understand that these things go together. And that support can come in different ways we might not even think about, like changing your payment terms. I can't tell you, cash flow is one of the most important things for small businesses. And you change your payment terms from 30 days to 90 days. That's incredibly hard for a small business. So, if there's one thing, I would ask is really think about how you can support small businesses.
Yeah, I've definitely heard that before. How unbelievable that is, even if you don't change your terms, but actually you just pay on time, that's so fundamental to the future of business operating. Yeah, it's so key. There are so many things that I think we could keep discussing, but maybe we should close it here and give everyone else a kind of an opportunity to maybe ask us some questions. I think we're going to be putting this out on LinkedIn, so really happy for people to ask us questions on the posts or get in touch. But yeah, so thank you very much for listening to Charlotte and I. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. And I don't know, Charlotte, over to you to close us out.
Thank you so much. We want this to be inspirational rather than making you want to run for the hills. This is all about the fact that this is something we can all do. It just takes a decision to start the journey, and it's a very, very rewarding one where you start to really get to know your business, your stakeholders even better, and I would say make a more robust, resilient business, which in this climate is incredibly important. So thank you so much for listening, supporting, and please do ask questions, put comments in, and we will come back to those and try to respond to them and start up a campaign to get more B Corps in the financial industry.
Great. Brilliant.
Thank you,
everyone.